Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Paul Buvarp, who is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, specializing in disinformation and foreign interference in digital media. Paul Buvarp, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to this.
Likewise. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Paul, will cover your recent research and work in Norway related to the demand side of disinformation, which sounds like a absolutely fascinating topic. But before we get into this topic, could we please start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Oh boy, where do we start? I feel like this whole conversation is going to be a long-winded answer to that question, but
okay, yeah.
Just to kind of set the stage, I think we have grossly underestimated what the internet has done to society in the last small generation that we've been online, and I think we're living in a world where, everyone's looking at artificial intelligence as this like whoa new thing, and we have to adapt to it and be ready to use it when it comes. But I don't think we've even managed to fully grasp how the internet has reshaped society, and especially the flow and use and utility and potential of information in our society. I think we're still running behind on that, and it's having a lot of pretty profound effects on what you call the strategic landscape or our times today.
Yep. Agree with all of that. So we met, Paul, just a few weeks ago in London at the Phoenix Challenge conference, which was co-sponsored by the UK Ministry of Defense and the US Department of Defense. And I got to tell you, Paul, you and we chatted a couple of times, and one of my most profound, or maybe my most profound takeaway from all of the discussions that I had at the conference was with you, and you said something that has really stuck with me, and I just want to try to describe it to our audience, and perhaps many in our audience are going to be like, John, man, that's not very profound, but it was for me. But you said something like this. You said truth, and let's not get into the philosophy of truth and all that kind of stuff at the moment. Let's just have a conversational definition of truth, meaning some things are more true than other things, right? But you said that truth is less prevalent on social media or in online spaces than it is in real world face-to-face interactions. And that just really blew me away. And it got me thinking about how social media and online spaces, again, you can parse this in all kinds of ways. It's like, well, social media and real life, it blends together. Okay, yes. I understand all of that. But in general, when people are engaging online, that is an environment, a system where truthful dialogue and truthful statements are just less common than in face-to-face interactions. And anyway, I've got more to,
Yeah.
say about that, but that was the thing that really blew me away.
Well, thanks. You flatter me, John. It's it's fun to hear. I sometimes say some smart things, but that whole line of thinking actually comes out from what is actually, it's a fairly controversial paper that appeared in the journal Science in 2018. And I'll just run through what the paper says in my terms rather quickly, and then we'll talk about the controversy. But the paper essentially went through 10 years of Twitter data and did a massive analysis on essentially what it calls the diffusion of different kinds of information. And it classed these different kinds of information into true and untrue statements. And in their conclusion, they find that untrue statements in online networks, and specifically on Twitter, but you can kind of draw the comparison across the internet as a whole. But online, falsehoods or untrue things diffuse farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than true information. And this got quite a lot of attention. So they were, featured in quite a lot of articles and everything. And this caused this rather big debate on whether their conclusion might have been a bit too, what should we say, too dramatic. Because essentially what they did was they looked at instances where there was fact checking or where there was a contestation around the truth or falsehood of a certain piece of information, and then they kind of followed the diffusion of either the debunked or the false content, and they found that the false content diffused faster and broader. And I think, like, yeah, we need to be very careful not to draw this paper to take it out of context and make it bigger than it is. But that is still a really, really dramatic and important finding. Because, I mean, when we talk in general about how, especially in kind of the pseudo-civil society, how people go about, combating disinformation, we even heard it at Phoenix Challenge, which this year was about the kill chain model, that it's about identifying these falsehoods. And the presumption is if you can identify the falsehoods, you could probably also like infuse a little bit of truth there, or like, fact check something, moderate something, debunk something. But if we then take the Vosoughi paper from 2018 in Science, then how can that work? Because what we're saying is that the medicine that we want for this problem can't even catch up to the problem as it races through the online network. And there are other papers that kind of, they don't exactly show the same thing, but they show equally concerning trends about, truth and untruth online and the way it works. So for example, you have Pennycook, who's I believe he's a social psychologist, who wrote a paper in Nature in 2021, where they found that even if a person knows or believes that something is untrue, the truth or untruth of that piece of information does not significantly change their motivation to share that information online. What does change it is it valuable socially to me? Is it, part of the in-group, out-group dynamic that I want to get something out of? Whether it's true or false, it goes pretty far down on the list on like reasons to share things online.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Huh. But by the way, to our audience, the paper that Paul was referring to, we'll have a link to it in the show notes, but it's called The Spread of True and False News Online from 2018 by Vosoughi, Roy, and Aral. So there's a link to that paper. Right. Yeah. So, continuing on with my revelation is, thinking about these as like completely different systems or environments. And again, there's arguments that can be made about how the information environment, these are complex systems, right? They're
Sure.
they're they're very difficult to identify where the boundaries are
Yeah.
and how to separate them and things along these lines. So, so stipulated, but these systems are so different that I've started thinking of like social media could be thought of as like a forest, and real life or face-to-face interactions, think of that as something that's very different from a forest, like a beach or a tropical landscape, right? Those environments are so different that people would be foolish to engage in both of those environments. Uh, it, you would be foolish to dress like you were going camping and you're at the beach.
Yeah.
Likewise, it would be foolish to dress like you're going to a tropical beach when in fact you're going snow skiing, right?
Yeah.
So you should dress mentally. You should dress mentally appropriately for the environment that you're engaging in, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, and it's funny you should draw that example, because when I give briefs to my military, the people who give our institution their uh, marching orders and the money and everything, when they ask, what have you found, I need to try to explain it to someone who wears green and has stripes on their shoulders,
Yeah.
And what I do is I'm grateful to AI that can let me kind of generate an image of a Norwegian Arctic geared soldier standing bewildered in the middle of of a jungle.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that kind
Yeah.
of, I use that image to show them, like, this isn't 1999 anymore. We're
Hmm.
living in 2025. We're living in a completely different information environment than what you are used to, than what kind of the stratcom training or psyops training like geared you up for.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we do need to figure out what environment we're at, and then try to maybe gear up in a way that is applicable to that environment.
Yeah.
So I absolutely buy your image there, and it's something I've used myself as well.
Right. How do you, I heard you stepping into this a little bit a moment ago, but how do you bring this into a supply and demand kind of an economics model of
Yeah,
disinformation?
yeah. So I think in a lot of the discourse, a lot of the strategic thinking about disinformation and foreign influence, it's very much focused, on the trolls in Russia and the Internet Research Agency, on the bot networks of China, or Iran. It's very much, supply side thinking. Like,
Hmm.
oh, if we're going to stop this, we need to stop the supply of disinformation into our
Ah,
system.
uh-huh.
Um, and that works in some respects. The Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg doesn't exist there anymore, and it's probably helpful to identify large bot networks spreading disinformation and all that. But I think the fundamental problem that we aren't looking at has much more to do with what I like to call the demand side. And I can illustrate that in a few different ways, but let's try this one. That there's a lot of discussion and a lot of talk about social media effects on young people these days. Like when teens scroll on Instagram, for example, it's pictures of unrealistic bodies and holidays and lifestyles that aren't healthy for a young mind,
Hmm.
and they become depressed or anxious, etc. Uh, but it's not like Meta, who owns Instagram. It's not like they're policy is to make young people depressed. Meta's policy is to generate this kind of algorithmic feed that keeps users on the phone, scrolling, looking at different posts. And it turns out that the same material that makes teenagers and young adults depressed is the same material that keeps them locked to their phone and scrolling. So this is a demand side problem. We have a demand for these unrealistic body images, these unrealistic holidays. It's what we want to see. And I think it's the same problem when it comes to disinformation, that we are tuned very much to want, to service our confirmation bias, to tell us how we're completely right about what we already think, to tell us how the other side is comically wrong about how they think. This is the kind of stuff that keeps us engaged. So if I'm on, Facebook or Twitter or something, and all I get is like really well thought out counter views to my own, I don't want to be there. It becomes uncomfortable for me. I don't get anything out of it. It's not socially fun.
Yeah.
And so you get these kind of the system kind of shapes itself to fit your worldview, and that kind of there's a major incentive to provide you with the information that matches, and that has no bearing on whether that information is true or not, and thus it becomes more of a demand side issue.
Yeah. Have you ever considered, something I've been thinking about a little bit recently is novelty, and how humans seek out novelty. And as you were concluding just a moment ago, Paul, you were like, if everything's the same, if all of the opinions match mine or something like that, then, well, that's boring. I don't want that. People in general don't want that, because what's the point? We want stimulation. We want novelty, and people seek out novelty in order to, well, there's well, it's a human thing. That's how humans learn. That's how humans explore. That's how people, test reality to judge, is this matching my priors of what reality has told me, over the course of my life? Okay, yes, that checks out. That reinforces my priors about whatever I'm testing. But that's how humans engage, is they want stimulation and novelty, and that's part of the demand side that you're describing.
Absolutely. And that's also partly the guess of Vosoughi and co. in the paper we talked about earlier, is that novelty is the driver of these kinds of stories. And there's also a very kind of succinct way of pointing this out, and that is that, the truth is one thing. The truth is immutable. It is this one thing that we can kind of latch onto. And the lies, the bullshit, the like alternative versions, they can be a billion different things. So just, I mean, from an arithmetic point of view, to like get as many people as possible onto the one thing out of a billion different stories you can tell about the same events, that's very difficult. And it becomes so much more fun to, try to find these little tweaks to your story. And partly I also think it's a little bit about how human beings tell stories too, right? So, I mean, anyone who's ever tried writing a story at school or whatever, you know that there's a structure that you kind of need to follow. You need to be aware of motivations, and you need to kind of build characters in this way. But in a major complex, ever changing, ever morphing world, telling coherent stories that kind of glom onto the way our brain processes stories is very difficult. There's this podcast about gossip where they did kind of is it called Chinese Whispers or something? This game where you kind of tell a story and then they tell the same story to another person, and then it goes along a chain, and then you compare the start of the story to the end of the story.
I've heard that called the game of telephone as well, or something.
Game
like
of telephone, yeah, perfect, yeah. And then in this case, it was a real story that they told at the beginning, which was a little bit, ambiguous, a little bit like, real humans with real complex feelings and foibles and everything. By the end of the chain of telephone, the story was very much turned into one person was the bad guy, one was the good guy. They did predictable kind of deceptions and very much following this almost Hollywoodized story. And that's, far from the truth, but it's also the way we tell stories. And it shows this kind of human tendency to try to assign motivations, to assign reason and rationality to something that might actually be more random. And the problem is that today where there's, information available to kind of confirm any sort of idea you want to bring in, you can kind of select for those stories that then tell you that kind of information that you want.
When in fact, not in fact, but the likelihood is that some of that was just randomly generated, or it was generated based upon the online tendency just to make stuff up. And yet it does or doesn't match what I want the world to be, or my sensibilities about the world.
Yeah, or it's simplified, or it's kind of aggrandized in one way, or it's minimized in another way. And these things, they then kind of like grow and disperse and become, even more separated from realness. And the problem that we have today is that it is these algorithms that are in large part running the game and are kind of driving, well, let's say it this way, that the internet and algorithms, they are what precision missiles are for war. So war was one thing, and then precision rocketry came along and it changed war. In the media, precision marketing online, the ability to gather profiles on individuals and then market to those individuals, changed the media game. And it became much more of a, let's gather as much data as possible about John, about Paul, and then we can tailor exactly what they want to see to them. In order to sell them plane tickets, or in order to sell them, a mattress when they need a new mattress, or a winter coat when, October rolls around. So, so what that did was build these kind of channels for individualized information to come across. And from the difference from before is obviously, newspapers and standard television and radio and all these things, they were in truth mass media. You had to tailor stories, you had to tailor, your descriptions of the world and of reality to a large audience that then also shared that story and kind of had common touchstones on, what they believed and how they viewed the world. And I think now that, the internet is really coming into its own, and these algorithms are becoming sharper and sharper, we are losing a little bit of that ability of, the mass mediation. It's not so much everyone getting the same story. And in some cases it is still, but in many cases it's losing that difference. So that's very concerning to me. Some people call this the demassification of the media. And I think they're right.
Yeah, we had an episode a couple of months ago now. I'm looking it up here in real time, but it was about algorithmic warfare with Libby Lange. Libby Lange
Right.
on algorithmic cognitive warfare. I'll put a
Yeah.
link to that in the show notes, but she describes, I think, the same thing that you're describing as well, Paul, a little bit differently, perhaps, but she's especially focused on China and how China is
Yeah.
engaging in this space. She lived in Taiwan for several years and is a cultural expert. Anyway, but she describes how China appears to be attempting to herd people into subgroups and then create for those subgroups expectations or a perspective on reality. I'm embellishing here, but perhaps
Sure, sure.
perhaps a lot of that is based on primarily on truth, but there are these embellishments or angles or sharpness of the algorithm, as you were just talking about, which
Hmm.
distorts things in uniform ways for these micro populations that can ultimately result in like cybernetic control on top of all of this. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in the U.S., the whole debate about the banning of TikTok does center around the national security angle, both in terms of taking or getting a lot of Americans' data, but also in terms of what can be done with the algorithm to show what the world looks like. Now, TikTok is a very, very interesting case and has been a front runner in the kind of algorithmic changing of social media, because in the good old days, you'd have like a social medium, you sign up for it, and it asks you a little bit about who do you want to follow, who's interesting to you, which perspectives do you want, and you click on these things,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then like they start to appear in your feed, and then it kind of shapes its profile of you around your picks. Now on TikTok, um, you can uh, you can follow people,
Hmm.
sure, but the For You page, the main page on TikTok, it does not care who you follow. The algorithm that shows you
Mm.
things there is purely on how many seconds you spend or what kind of reactions you have to the content that it shows you. So it spends a little bit of time to like learn what you look at,
Yeah.
and then it just
Yeah.
feeds you with that and does not care. So like
Yeah.
if I, for example, sign up for TikTok, I don't have TikTok. I'm not allowed to have TikTok. But if I'd signed up for it and been like, I want to follow, the Information Professionals Association and the New York Times and the local uh, news outlets in Norway, yeah, I'll be a good, sane TikTok user. It wouldn't really matter because it would just show me cat
Mm.
videos and deck
Hmm.
building and barbecuing, all the same. But then this becomes even more um, uh, interesting, because this super sharp algorithm is exactly what makes TikTok the most popular social medium of the time.
Hmm.
And it also forces Facebook and Twitter, now X, to employ equally sharp algorithms that equally kind of don't show you things you think you want to see,
Hmm.
but show
Yeah.
you things that it can verifiably prove you want to see. And then you get studies. It's really interesting. In Norway and the US, you have the exact same number, uh, and that number is 4 out of 10 young adults prefer to get their news from TikTok than from traditional news sources.
Mm.
And I was on this debate stage with a Norwegian youth politician who said this, that he preferred to get news from the Middle East from TikTok and not through Norwegian media. And like my gut reaction when someone says that, and I'm guessing quite a few of the people who are listening here would be, oh my God, like these kids, they don't know the value of true media. They're lazy. They don't understand critical media. Like they're not plugged into the real world. But I think I've spent some time thinking about this, and their argument would be that they have the more authentic real world than we do, because in their view, like
You're talking about TikTok here.
TikTok, right?
Okay. I mean, this is what those people who prefer to get their news content from TikTok would say.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
they would say that the traditional media, the Fox News, the MSNBC, the CNNs, they are editorializing, they are slow on the ball, and they have an agenda in what they're trying to show you, all of which is true. On TikTok, you get, someone on the ground who isn't a media professional filming as the bomb goes off in Gaza or in Israel. And you scroll a little bit further and there's this Israeli or this Palestinian talking about what happened in their language, and it's subtitled with what you want to know. And so their argument is that this is so much more authentic than the traditional real media of the past. Now, the problem is they don't see that this also is hugely mediated through this algorithm, and it will only show you one side of the conflict, and it will only it will only show you the storytelling that kind of fits with your profile. And it won't give you, the 50-year context of this conflict and what it means and what it could mean for the spillover into Iran, or et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes a very myopic, very focused view of reality. But nonetheless, they would argue that it's more real than the editorialized media that we rely on. And I think, if we don't understand that, then we have there's no hope in telling these kids like, oh no, social media is bad, you should come watch CNN. To them, it's ludicrous, and they've made up their mind.
Wow. Holy cow. That is a take that I am still absorbing. So no, that's good. I want to take just one other perspective on all of this, which hasn't come up explicitly, but hear what your reaction is, and that's again the difference between on one extreme, two humans interacting face to face, like in an intimate setting. Like, I don't know, you and I, Paul, are not in the same room, but let's just say you and I are talking face to face, right? Compare that to online social media where, millions of people are interacting with one another. In a one-on-one setting or a small group setting, there is there is there is a bigger cost reputationally to the group or to the relationship to lie to the other person or to deceive or to interact in a way that's not in good faith, right? If you do that over and over and over again with friends and loved ones and even people you're interacting with casually face to face, that's going to have a cost to you over time. People are not going to trust you. People aren't going to want to interact with you. Like, hey man, we're trying to do something constructive here, and every 10th sentence, I'm discovering that you're lying or you're BSing me or you're not being serious. What the heck?
Yeah.
Screw you.
Yeah.
There's a cost to bogus or untruthful interactions in face-to-face compared to online, where those kinds of costs are different.
Mhm.
Yeah, how do you drop that into this whole kind of discussion space that we've been having?
Yeah, so in the first instance, one thing I try to always make clear is that social media should be understood more as social than as media, in the kind of, we use media to tell news stories, for example. It's a much more social platform, or they are much more social platforms, and they are built on the rules of social behavior among
Hmm. Hmm.
human beings. And so you have extremely powerful in-group and out-group dynamics in these places, such that, I mean, I'm sure you personally, I certainly feel very different in my like social environment if I'm in a one-to-one conversation, or if I'm in a room with 100 people and everyone's kind of milling about and doing
Mm.
their thing,
Hmm.
right? Now imagine that you're in this room and it's not 100 people, but it's 100 million people
Hmm.
potentially.
Hmm. Hmm.
And everyone can kind of tune in to hear exactly what you're telling this other person. And instinctively, because you've grown up on this place, or you've established your ideas based on what you've read elsewhere online. In this room of 100,000 or 100 million people who can tune into exactly what you're saying, you know that whatever you say, you will have supporters. So you're not playing for the other person necessarily. You're talking to the audience that is watching you. This is very much what happens, for example, on X, where
Hmm.
the whole point is to get likes and to get reshares and or tweets or whatever. Um, and it's not necessarily to convince whoever it is you are replying to or talking to, but it's to demonstrate the size of the team behind you.
Mm.
Sometimes some people take pride in having a small team behind them, but it's very, very uncomfortable to be the only one advancing a story and then being told you're wrong. But if online you can advance a story and you know that you can get enough people behind you, and especially if you play on like very divisive, very incendiary things, the algorithm loves it because it
Hmm.
engages a lot of people. It gets people to click and react and even comment on these things, which is hugely valuable to the social network. And so there's a lot of research on these algorithms promoting certain types of speech that might not be the most pro-social, but are the most pro-algorithm. And that is definitely the case. But yeah, we should think of these spaces as very far from intimate spaces. And I, I believe there's also this innate psychological thing that for the past 600 years, we've grown accustomed to Times New Roman as kind of an official looking script.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
and so like in the old days, if I passed you a handwritten note saying something, and then I passed you like a BBC article printed out that said the same thing, you would or another thing, you would much rather believe the BBC article. If I
Uh,
take away the headline and the source that it is the BBC, you would still much rather believe the BBC article because it's written in a professional script.
okay. Yeah.
But now everything online is written in the same script. I mean, you can have the most BS conspiratorial space online that is, it's written as if it is a highbrow literary journal
Hmm.
in the way it looks. And I think that also kind of like bypasses some of our defenses or the innate defenses that we used to have, at least on
Mm.
trustworthy information.
That is a super interesting observation. I mean that that
I mean,
feels
there's
that I
a
mean
there's a
that
really interesting thought experiment you could do.
yeah.
You can see, like, if something's written in Comic Sans and something's written in Garamond, which are you going to believe?
Right. No, I mean that just feels right to me. That a comparing a handwritten note to something that's printed out. Yeah, it's like, well, the thing printed out. I mean, someone put more time and effort
Yeah,
and energy into
yeah,
getting this onto a piece of paper and printing it out
yeah,
than someone did scribbling out a note.
yeah.
The one that looks more polished must be must have more truth infused into it. I mean, I'm being a little silly there, but I can see
No,
exactly
but
what you were saying.
yeah,
It bypasses some of our critical thinking or something like
for
that.
sure, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, Paul, this has been a absolutely fascinating conversation for me. I've really appreciated. Do you think maybe we could close out? Do you have like a book or other online resource that could either be something related to this general topic space, or it could be just some other book recommendation that you might have
Sure,
for the
sure.
audience?
Um, it's great that you ask. It's something I do at the end of my lectures. Is I pull up three books and just
Okay,
say, read
perfect.
these if you like them,
Yeah.
if you like what I've been talking about. So I'll just tell you the ones I have on my slide these weeks, and it's someone who was very much influential in shaping kind of my system's view of what the internet has done with us, and it's probably not surprising to you or others, is Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death,"
Mm,
published 1985, and it's essentially Neil Postman was a McLuhan uh, apostle, I guess I can call him, who
okay.
uh,
Okay.
who focused a lot on like the structural consequences of media, and his analysis in "Amusing Ourselves to Death" is on essentially the TV as a medium and what it does to the public debate and the public sphere. But it's been given quite a lot of attention recently in popular culture, because it seems very prescient in terms of what social media also has done
Okay.
to our
Yeah.
society. So it's an old one, but a good one. Um, I think I'll just do two books, but the other book that I would recommend, which I'm finding really fascinating right now, is called The Paradox of Democracy by Zach Gershberg and Sean Illing. Um, it kind of rethinks democracy uh, more as a mode of societal communication rather than as, staid, uh, set in stone institutions,
Hmm.
and then kind of does a bit of thinking about what free speech and open media does in this kind of system, and kind of talks about how um, every illiberal democracy has come out of a liberal democracy, and why does it happen that way, and very, very interesting thinking about the media and how it affects society.
Wow. Okay. Those are two dynamite suggestions, and I think I'll actually check both of them out myself.
Well,
Uh,
I hope so.
the latter one there, the paradox of democracy. I've recently been thinking a bit about this as well, and uh, I I think people commonly hear something like the the strength of democracy or is the openness
Yeah.
of the dialogue, meaning
Sure.
and by openness, meaning the public debate, the dissent, the elections that are held, the competing ideas, and which ideas or ways of looking at the world or managing the society, which wind up achieving success either momentarily or for longer terms. Those that open churn, which is visible, or somewhat visible or mostly visible, depending upon which democracy, et cetera, et cetera. There are
Hmm.
sh there
Hmm.
are sh there are shades of gray here, but that general open dialogue makes societies stronger ultimately,
Hmm.
even
Hmm.
though it's messy and contentious but ultimately the society winds up being stronger for those kinds of disagreements. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I have to be very, very clear with your listeners and with you
Hmm.
here that
Yeah,
these are just like small little threads of thought in my brain. But
yeah.
I think that there is a need to, how should I put this? Freedom of speech as it is conceived and as this like strength and fundamental principle of democracy is absolutely true. But that idea is also built on 600 years of mass media
Mm, mm,
technology.
mm,
And let's be clear, freedom of speech did not exist before mass media. It wasn't a like established right before, or in the modern sense, before we had the printing press, before we had books, before we had, you know, these ways of reaching the masses.
mhm, mhm.
And in this whole time of the mass media up until the mid 90s, when the internet becomes like a public open space, in those 600 years, we had the Enlightenment, we had the birth of modern democracy, we had constitutions were written, and freedom of speech becomes this big important thing. But I think there's a major difference between freedom of speech in a world where you have newspaper editors and radio broadcasters and book publishers who are picky about
Mhm.
which speeches go out broadly to the public
Yeah.
and which are relegated to the soapbox on the corner of, I don't know, this and this street
Right.
and avenue.
There's an editorial process that happens.
there, there's an editorial process to the reach
Uh-huh.
of
Yeah.
that speech.
Yeah.
Now, we have gone very quickly and very abruptly and without much critical thinking from that
Mm.
world into a world where anyone on a soapbox can have a reach that is beyond the wildest dreams of a
Mhm.
19th century book publisher.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think there might need to be a little bit of thinking about what does freedom of speech mean
Mhm, mhm.
in the age of, unfettered internet and social media and all of this stuff. And I know some people will think that that's a very dangerous thing to say, but
Yep. Yep.
but I mean, I do think we need to be honest that the world looks very different today than it did before. I'm not arguing for curtailing anything. I'm just saying we
Mhm.
do need to think a little bit about what this means.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, typically this is the wrap up portion of the podcast. But I mean, this longtime listeners of the Cognitive Crucible hear me bring this concept up occasionally, and there's a complexity science concept called the law of requisite variety. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that, Paul, but
Uh,
there's there's a fellow who is a contemporary with all of the mid 20th century cybernetics thinkers like von Neumann and Wiener and Claude Shannon. His name was Ross Ashby, and he came up with Ashby's law of requisite variety. And what the law and apparently this is like undisputed, right? No one has been able to come up with an argument that is like, nah, that's trash, right? So what I'm about to say, I think, is a very well respected concept within complexity science, and it goes something like this: is that systems, in any system, has to be able to adapt to the variety of activities which are being thrust upon the system. And so whether it's a single cell organism all the way up to a complex society, all of those systems have to be able to deal with the stimuli which are part of its natural environment. And what we've been describing, and what you were just describing just a moment ago, Paul, was we have this new way of living and engaging in the world, which has completely bypassed a lot blown past our traditional ways of consuming information. And it's something that we, and I mean the world, I don't mean just Western societies or Norway or the United States, but the world has to figure out how to deal with this new way of ingesting information, which at this very moment, and we're recording this on April 1st, 2025. I'm not kidding though. We have to figure out how to accommodate this new variety of stimuli so that we can productively go about pursuing our activities without everything sliding off the cliff.
I absolutely agree with you, and that is kind of what I want people to go away with from this thing. And I think, like in a lot of meetings, and what is the state of the world, and all these things, you start off with, okay, so we have indicators that trust in society is diminishing. People are more depressed than they were 20 years ago, especially teenagers. People feel more despondent about their leaders and about their media. There's less trust between people. There's a loneliness epidemic. There's, populist politics in Europe, in the United States. There is, on the one hand, and then identitarian politics on the other hand. I think all of these things, maybe not like are fully caused, but are significantly caused by this blowing past of Ashby's law. These are the spillover effects of an information flood that has burst the gates and is kind of cascading through these different systems, overflowing and creating these challenges for our modern society, not least of which is, what is true in the world. And if we don't know what's true in the world, then we're in trouble.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Paul Buvarp, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.